Your money doesn't disappear overnight. If it did, people would panic. And panic is the one thing governments cannot afford. So instead, value fades, quietly, legally, slowly, at a pace just comfortable enough for people to adapt. And that's how every currency crisis begins, not with chaos, not with riots, not with collapse, but with comfort. Comfort is the warning sign no one is trained to fear. Prices rise slightly. Officials reassure the public. Experts appear on television and say the same words every time. This is temporary. This is under control. This is normal. And people believe them, not because it's true, but because believing feels safer than questioning. That's the first mistake. Because once a currency starts weakening, it never resets. It only accelerates. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. Currency crises are not accidents. They are processes. They follow patterns. They leave clues. And they always choose winners and losers. You're sorted whether you notice it or not. If you recognize the pattern early, you protect yourself. If you don't, you pay. Quietly, over years. So let's rewind. Every major currency crisis begins with a promise that sounds reasonable in the moment and reckless in hindsight. It usually sounds like this. We need to stabilize the economy. We need to protect jobs. We need to support growth. And to do that, governments spend money they don't have. Not once, not temporarily, but repeatedly. At first, nothing seems wrong. Debt rises, deficits grow, but daily life stays normal. No shelves are empty, no banks collapse, no alarms go off, so people relax. That relaxation is the real trigger. This is the most dangerous phase of any currency crisis, the calm phase. Because currency crises don't begin when things look bad. They begin when things look manageable. Here's the first warning sign most people miss. The money supply grows faster than the real economy. More currency enters the system, but productivity doesn't increase at the same rate. That gap matters more than any headline, because money only holds value when it represents real output, real work, real goods, real services. When money grows faster than reality, value gets diluted. Not destroyed overnight, diluted. Like adding water to juice. You still have juice, you just need more of it to taste the same. That's why inflation always arrives before collapse. Inflation isn't the disease, it's the symptom. At this point, governments face a choice. They can slow spending and cause pain now, or they can delay the pain and multiply it later. History shows what they usually choose. They delay. Why? Because slowing down hurts voters immediately. Inflation hurts quietly. And quiet pain is politically convenient. So stimulus continues. Debt expands. Interest rates stay low. And asset prices rise. This is where people get confused. Stocks climb. Real estate surges. Crypto explodes. People point at the charts and say, see, everything's fine. But what's really happening is simpler and far more dangerous. Assets aren't rising because the economy is stronger. They're rising because the currency is weaker. You don't feel poorer yet because your numbers are going up. But numbers aren't wealth. Purchasing power is. And your purchasing power is already leaking. This leads to the next phase, the normalization phase. Inflation stops being shocking. Higher prices become routine. Smaller portions feel normal. People adjust. They complain less. They accept more. They downgrade quietly. Once people adapt psychologically, the system gets permission to continue. No protests, no panic, just acceptance. But the math keeps deteriorating. Here's another pattern that never fails. To fight inflation, central banks raise rates slowly, cautiously, and too late. Why too late? Because raising rates aggressively would crash markets. And crashing markets exposes the truth, so they move carefully. And careful doesn't fix structural damage. It only buys time. Meanwhile, interest payments on government debt explode. More debt means higher servicing costs. Higher servicing costs require more borrowing. The system starts feeding itself. This is when confidence begins to crack, not among ordinary citizens, but among institutions. Foreign holders hedge, central banks diversify, long-term investors shorten their time horizon. Nothing dramatic happens, that's the point. Slightly weaker auctions, higher risk premiums, more volatility. The currency still exists, but trust is thinner. And currencies run on trust. At this stage, the average person still doesn't feel a crisis. They feel pressure, life tightens, savings stretch less, wages fall behind prices. But nothing screams collapse, and that's the trap. Because by the time a currency crisis feels obvious, the damage is already done. Here's the hardest truth most people never hear. Currency crises don't wipe people out suddenly. They sort them. They reward debtors. They punish savers. They protect asset owners. They crush fixed incomes. They favor those closest to money creation and drain those farthest from it. This sorting doesn't happen at the end. It happens throughout the process, quietly, relentlessly. And most people never realize they're losing until the system has already moved on. By the time a currency crisis becomes visible, the most important decisions have already been made. quietly, far from public view. This is where most people misunderstand how these systems actually work. They assume collapse comes from chaos, from panic, from sudden loss of control. In reality, collapse comes from management. Because once inflation becomes normal, the system doesn't break, it adapts. And that adaptation always favors the same group. Here's the shift most people miss. When prices rise slowly over time, society recalibrates, not consciously, instinctively. People stop comparing prices to last year. They compare them to last month. Shock disappears, memory shortens, expectations lower. That psychological adjustment is more important than any economic metric, because once people adapt, resistance dies, and systems survive on compliance, not approval. At this stage, governments no longer need to convince people that inflation is temporary. They only need to convince them it's manageable. This is where language changes. Inflation becomes sticky, debt becomes sustainable, currency weakness becomes competitive, words soften reality, and softened reality keeps people calm. Meanwhile, the mechanics underneath grow harsher. As inflation settles in, something fundamental flips. Cash stops being neutral. Holding money feels responsible. But in a weakening currency, responsibility is punished. Every month you hold cash, you lose purchasing power silently, automatically, no announcement required. So people who understand the system stop saving money and start avoiding it. They borrow, they leverage, they move into assets. This isn't greed, it's math. When currency weakens, debt gets cheaper in real terms. You repay tomorrow with money worth less than what you borrowed today. This is why long currency declines always reward leverage and punish caution. The system teaches this lesson slowly, then reinforces it relentlessly. At the same time, wages lag. They always do, not because employers are evil, but because wages are sticky by nature. Prices adjust instantly, contracts adjust quarterly, salaries adjust yearly, if at all. By the time wages rise, the loss has already happened. This creates the most common feeling of a currency crisis, working harder, earning more, and still falling behind. People don't feel robbed, they feel tired. And tired people don't rebel, they adapt. Now zoom out. As citizens adjust, institutions reposition. Foreign holders reduce exposure quietly. Central banks diversify reserves. Long-term investors shorten duration, not dramatic exits, gradual hedges. Confidence doesn't disappear, it thins. And thin confidence changes behavior long before it shows up in headlines. Currencies don't collapse when trust disappears. They weaken when trust becomes conditional. At this stage, the average person still doesn't believe they're in a crisis. They believe they're in a difficult period. That distinction matters because difficult periods justify patience, and patience is expensive. This is where asset prices become confusing. Stocks rise, real estate climbs, everything looks expensive, people assume wealth is being created. But this isn't growth, it's repricing. When the measuring stick weakens, everything measured with it looks bigger. Assets didn't improve, the currency did. This creates the illusion of prosperity. And illusions delay correction. The longer correction is delayed, the more fragile the system becomes. Now, central banks face their trap. Raise rates aggressively and expose how dependent the system is on cheap money. Move too slowly and let inflation entrench itself. So they compromise, careful hikes, reassuring language, data-dependent decisions, which is another way of saying delay. Markets understand delay. They price it in. Volatility becomes permanent, not crashes, instability. Up one quarter, down the next, no clear direction. This instability taxes normal people more than crashes ever do, because instability destroys planning. You can't plan savings. You can't plan retirement. You can't plan risk. Short-term thinking takes over, and short-term systems are easier to control. This is another pattern history repeats, without exception. When money loses reliability, trust collapses inward. People trust themselves first, then family, then tangible assets. Institutions become conditional. Promises become suspect. Long-term guarantees weaken. Nothing breaks suddenly. Everything degrades gradually. This is also where inequality hardens. Not explodes, hardens. Those closest to money creation feel protected. Those dependent on wages feel squeezed. Those on fixed incomes feel trapped. But still, nothing has collapsed. And that's why people keep waiting. They wait for a signal, a headline, a moment. But currency crises don't announce themselves. They normalize. And once normalized, the final phase becomes inevitable. Not collapse, but constraint. By the time a currency crisis reaches its final stage, something important has already changed. Not the numbers, not the charts, not even inflation. People change. This is the phase most never recognize because it doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like restriction, not collapse, not chaos, but narrowing. Options shrink, choices become limited, mobility slows down, and almost no one announces it. This is where control quietly replaces confidence. You don't wake up one day unable to access your money. You just notice more friction, more rules, more verification, more temporary measures, withdrawal limits, transaction monitoring, reporting thresholds, new taxes, compliance layers. Each one sounds reasonable. Each one is framed as protection. But stacked together, they reshape behavior. You can still move money, just not freely. You can still spend, just not anonymously. You can still save, just not without cost. Nothing feels illegal, but everything feels heavier. And that's the point. At this stage, the system no longer runs on trust. It runs on compliance. Most people don't resist, because resistance is expensive. So they adapt, they follow the rules, they adjust expectations, they accept less, slowly. This is also where the language changes. Governments stop talking about growth. They start talking about resilience. They stop promising opportunity. They promise stability. That shift alone tells you everything. Because stability becomes the goal only when expansion is no longer possible. By now, the sorting is complete. Asset owners feel protected. Debtors feel relieved. Savers feel trapped. Fixed incomes feel squeezed. But nothing has collapsed. That's why people keep waiting. Waiting for a headline. Waiting for a crash. Waiting for a moment that confirms what they feel. But currency crises don't end with moments. They end with acceptance. And acceptance is powerful. Because once people accept a lower baseline, it becomes permanent. Here's the truth. Most explanations avoid. Currency crises don't wipe people out suddenly. They lock them in. Not broke, not starving, just stuck. Savings stop mattering. Upward mobility slows. Risk becomes unaffordable. Mistakes become permanent. Life narrows. And when life narrows, people stop asking big questions. They focus on routines, on stability, on staying afloat. That's the quiet victory of a long currency decline. It doesn't create rebellion. It creates exhaustion. And exhausted populations don't revolt. They adapt. This is why currency crises rarely end. They transition, sometimes into a new monetary system, sometimes into debt restructurings, sometimes into a reset that benefits institutions far more than people. The system continues, just at a lower level of freedom. This is why older generations often say, things used to be easier. They're not being nostalgic. They lived under a different monetary phase. And this is why younger generations feel like they're doing everything right, but still falling behind. They are. The rules changed, quietly, legally, gradually. So what does understanding this pattern actually give you? Not fear, not panic, not predictions. It gives you orientation. You stop waiting for headlines. You stop reacting to noise. You stop trusting reassurances designed to calm, not inform. You start thinking in systems instead of events. You understand that inflation is not the crisis. Debt is not the crisis. Volatility is not the crisis. The real crisis is the slow loss of optionality. The moment when fewer choices exist, and most people don't notice until they're gone. And once you see that, you stop asking, will it collapse? And start asking, who is this system designed to protect now? That question changes everything. Because history is clear about one thing. The people who survive currency crises best are not the loudest, not the smartest, and not even the richest. They are the ones who understand where power is moving before it finishes moving. They don't fight the system. They don't deny reality. They don't wait for permission. They position early. They stay flexible. They think long-term in a short-term world. No hacks, no guarantees, no magic assets, just awareness, timing, and restraint. That's how people survive long declines, not by predicting collapse, but by refusing to be the last ones to adapt. If this helped you understand what's really happening, hit like. It helps this reach people who need to see it. Subscribe if you want more calm, honest breakdowns of money, power, and history. Without hype, without fear, and without noise. Because the biggest mistakes aren't made during crises. They're made long before people realize they're in one.